Perfect. We will get started, and if there's more participants, I'll just make sure that they get into the session.
Great, thanks, Santana. All right, well then, hello everyone. My name is Michelle Kinney, and I work with the Law Society of Nunavut. And I would like to welcome you all today to what I think is going to be a super interesting CLE on trauma-informed approaches to legal service delivery and design, with a focus on considerations for family law, mediators, lawyers, and legal practitioners. So I would like to welcome Erin Leakey, who is going to present for us today. I've had Erin come to my class in Victoria at the Law School in Victoria to present on the family law course there before, and I think that he has such great wisdom to share with us. I'm going to give you a quick little bio for him, but there is a full bio up on the Law Society website where there's also some of his upcoming publications named, which might be helpful for you in the future. But Erin is a research fellow at the BC Access Justice Centre for Excellence and an instructor in law, dispute resolution, and legal design at the University of Victoria. His interdisciplinary PhD research is focused on the way that legal design activity and legal institutions can be responsive to the needs and justice visions of persons with a lived experience of family violence. He has taught numerous mediators and numerous mediation programs and is currently the manager of training at Mediate BC. He also just he got back, I know he just got back recently from Finland, where he was invited to speak on some of the stuff that he'll be talking to us about today. And I'm excited to welcome Erin here to talk to us. I think his talk will be very valuable, and I'm just going to pass it over to Erin. We'll have about, I think, a presentation of maybe up to 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll leave some time for questions and some discussion at the end. So please hold your questions and either bring them up at the end or put them in the comment boxes, and we'll do our best to get to those at the end of the discussion. So thank you, Erin. Welcome, and I hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for that warm welcome. And it really is a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm coming today from the University of Victoria, the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. I want to thank the Law Society of Nunavut for their openness and hosting a webinar on this topic. There's a lot of interest, and it's really encouraging to me that so many folks that are invested in mediation and in legal service delivery are interested in the application of trauma-informed principles to legal service delivery and design. And I want to just say hello to all my friends out there. I know that there's some from Mediate BC and JIBC in the Ministry of Attorney General who are also joining us today. As Michelle noted, this presentation is going to be recorded. We're going to have a short window at the end of the presentation where we can do a little bit of a Q&A. And I often integrate photos from my travels with this presentation. So this is a very famous alleyway in Europe. So if anyone can guess right off the bat where it is, there'll be a prize. The prize is 1 hour of service with Michelle Kinney Law. No, I'm just joking. That was my joke in there. But if you do know where this famous alleyway is, pop that in the chat. I'm also going to note that I'm in a new office at the University of Victoria that has light issues. So at some point it might flick dark. I'm going to have to go over there and turn it back on. So today's presentation applies trauma-informed principles to family mediation. I've expanded the scope a little bit, so it includes trauma-informed principles applied at every touch point that one might encounter at the legal system. It includes consideration for trauma and intimate partner violence, and trauma as it relates to the history and legacy of colonialism, which are naturally going to draw on some very complex discussions that are being had around the design of family mediation in circumstances of intimate partner violence. There's a lot of different perspectives on whether or not it's appropriate, and we're going to talk about that. And the design of legal institutions themselves with consideration for legal pluralism, and in particular, the relationship between Indigenous and Western legal institutions and nations. I've assumed that there's some preliminary background information on trauma-informed practice and that information is more widely available. So rather than go in depth into trauma-informed practice, I will touch on it a little bit. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into family mediation and legal service design. First, I wanted to give a preliminary note so you know a little bit where I'm coming from here. This is kind of like revealing some of my biases. My own work focuses on what is called the justice gap. So the justice gap refers to a broad divergence. You see the gap in between the two cliffs there, between the way that a person with a lived experience of violence, if I were to ask them, how do you conceptualize justice? What is justice to you? The type of indicators and measures that they would give back to me, in the way that institutions, formal legal institutions, conceptualize, design, and build programs around the idea of justice. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this in depth, but just a couple notes on lived experience justice. They tend to be plural indicators. And there, I'm going to flip to the next slide. There's a broad range of them that change and they take different trajectories over time. They're not linear. It's not like A, B, C, and they're subjective. So they're very personal. And they have more to do with an experience of justice. So this particular scholar, Hester et al. In 2023, looked at the perceived justice indicators of 251 survivors of violence and found things like recognition, fairness, agency, so having a voice in the process, effective justice, which has to do with personal well-being, empowerment, right? So having a say in how the process unfolds, building their own capacity, accountability, fairness and equality in outcomes, reparation, social transformation, and protection from future harm. So I'm interested in legal systems that begin to close the gap between the way that someone might experience justice and the way that our formal legal institutions deliver justice. So in a legal system, if we're to think of it this way, when someone who's experienced violence engages it, they engage in multiple touch points along the legal system. There are points of interaction, and there's many of them along the way. And what I'd like to suggest is something very simple and probably intuitive, that every touch point in a legal institution is an opportunity to embed the measures of lived experience justice. Or today we're going to talk about the principles of trauma-informed practice. Justice have very little to do with the design and architecture of the institution itself, and more to do with the way that the legal system actor relates with an individual. In the literature, there's this very interesting phrase that appears. Survivors of violence might say, I was engaged in a legal system. It wasn't, for the most part, they don't view these system experiences as positive experiences, but they identify being lucky, which means that they found someone who's supportive, who's safe and helpful, who's the right legal actor. And while it's unfortunate on some level that survivors of violence are relying on luck in legal institutions, it's also encouraging what we can build in at every touch point of legal system. We want to be, in a way, those points of luck that people encounter along the way in their journey. So let's now turn and talk a little bit about trauma. Just a brief overview here. It's a catch-all phrase used to describe experiences of violence and its aftermath. It's considered to be a unique individual experience that impacts psychological arousal, emotion, cognition, and memory and disrupts a person's ability to process emotional responses, i.e., it makes it challenging to regulate. It's unique and individual in that what causes trauma in one person, there's an array of factors that mean it may or may not cause trauma in another person. Arousal, emotional, cognitive, and memory disruptions point to what Besser von der Kolk, and I think he uses a very helpful phrase called body memory, sort of how the body remembers. And what this is referring to is with the initial event of harm, there's been a process of fear learning where the body and the mind, they kind of coordinate and work together to say, I want to anticipate and I want to ensure that harm like that never happens again. So I begin to scan my environment for signals or cues that I may be unsafe. Okay? If I see a signal that may relate to the initial event of harm that I may be unsafe, you've heard the phrase before, there may be a trigger or an activation, which can include something like fight, flight, fawn, freeze, tend, and befriend, which are viewed as normal responses to the initial event of harm, but over time, they may be misactivating or missignaling, or there may be hypervigilance where someone continually scans their environment for a threat. I've noted the bullet there around extinction. It refers to the reversal of the fear process, where there's a breaking over time of the association between the cue or the signal that someone might be unsafe and the activation and the trigger. Normally, this is done in a therapeutic setting through processes of exposure to the fear stimuli, which work quite effectively, assuming that the original source of the trauma is removed. However, research suggests that fear learning, so fear that is derivative from the original event of harm, it never really goes away. It's generalizable across many contexts, and it can always, even if it's latent, be activated. But what I find hopeful in the literature is that extinction is context specific. That means that in very particular environments, we can create a context where the relationship between the signal or the cue and the trigger or the activation is reduced or almost gone in entirety. And I'm going to also make a caveat here that the word trauma is often used in very different ways and colloquial ways in society, and it can be misused itself. So if for those of us that are involved in mediation, we often hear clients, they might accuse each other of traumatizing. You've traumatized me. I've used the word trauma. I joke with my sister all the time where we say, everyone in our generation is traumatized and in counseling. But it's not really a correct use of the term. We have to keep in mind that trauma is a formal diagnosis, right? And that it comes with very specific symptoms that can be measured. Yet, it's not totally incorrect, the cultural use of the term trauma, in that many people have experienced a traumatic experience in their life. Up to 50% of the population, for example, may have experienced. And so what that means is that it's very hard to talk about trauma without talking also about resilience, as the vast majority of people demonstrate high resilience in the face of trauma, which means that they're able to return to a stable emotional state. To the next slide on Indigenous experience in legal institutions. As I was reflecting with Michelle in advance of this presentation, I thought it would be helpful to talk about how my own identity as a non-Indigenous person, as a second-generation European, he, him, heteronormative, white male, intersects with discussions of the history and legacy of colonialism. And so I just want to add a few reflections before we go into the material. So even though the slide is Indigenous experience in legal institutions, I am not an expert in Indigenous experience. Individuals, Indigenous people, are experts in their own experience. I have to consider the history and the legacy of colonialism and how my own identity might position me in power relationships. What kind of privileges come being a professor, a white male, that are unafforded to me, and how those might construct power relationships, even in and through my participation in justice activity. So that means that I need to constantly be open to feedback. I need to not think that I've overcome biases. One of the things that I think about is if you say, where does colonialism exist? Well, it exists in law, it exists in concrete programs, it's visible in all those spaces. But where it exists, ultimately, where we'll see it in the micro dimensions, is in individual consciousness. Decolonial writers often write about we have to decolonize the mind, and that includes folks from every perspective and vantage point. So I can't think that I have no biases that have been internalized. When it comes to justice activity, Indigenous people are the leaders of their own justice activity, but I can be a collaborator through relationships that are mutual and reciprocal and when I'm invited. So I wanted to add those reflections before giving a few other caveats to this section that come out of the literature. So there's a range of Indigenous experiences, and across Canada, there's a plurality of Indigenous cultural traditions. And so we don't always want to automatically assume that Indigenous experience is associated with trauma. And nor do I want to assume that there's a homogeneity of Indigenous experience. So there's going to be a broad range of how people have experienced these things in the history and legacy of colonialism. And trauma is a dynamic rather than categorical experience. So it's not like a fixed mode of being. So again, just to always consider that people move between modes of resilience and modes of trauma, almost like a continuum. So that said, I will make then some generalizable considerations that there's a history and legacy of Indigenous involvement with Western legal institutions that has been violent and genocidal, and that many Indigenous people have been traumatized through their involvement with Western law, Western programs that have come through law, the way that law is also a norm and forms some of our biases in society. And this is due to programs and policies that many of us are probably familiar with. So assimilative practices that have attempted to diminish or eradicate cultural identity, violence in programs like the residential school system that exposed up to 150,000 children between 1883 and 1996 to a range of violent behaviors that included physical, emotional, sexual assault, deprivation, separation from core family members, attempts to eradicate culture, and poor health conditions. So what we know from empirical data is that over 60% of residential school survivors do have formal post-traumatic stress disorder diagnoses. And what emerges in literature on Indigenous experience in Western legal institutions is a concern that primary trauma from programs and engagement with Western law and residential school systems there's concern about it being transmitted intergenerationally. And so that's when the effects of trauma, such as poverty, substance use, and mental health, shape family experience and also shape experience Indigenous involvement in Western legal institutions. So all that said, now we're going to move into trauma-informed practice a little bit. I'll offer a couple considerations. So the first is that a participation in a legal institution may itself, a Western legal institution, be a trigger. And in a mediation context, we're often thinking of mediation that's co-located with courthouses that open and begin with police checks at the very beginning and are co-located with services like and agencies like the Ministry of Children and Family Development. So we have to think about that from a trauma-informed practice perspective. And the second consideration is that although Western legal institutions talk a lot about impartiality, they're in fact not impartial institutions, and is pointed out by with assumptions. And those assumptions contain, by and large, a Western worldview. Some of the work I've done with Kelly Douglas, who I believe, may be here today, looks at the way that interest-based mediation contains forms of Western assumptions of a Western worldview, such as individualism, individual people with individual interests. It prioritizes distributive rather than relational outcomes. It includes a view that time is linear rather than holistic. So there is risk then, in shorthand, that simply participation in Western institution risks the imposition of a Western worldview. So we want to keep that in mind. And then the third consideration is around how power relationships are created in colonialism and how they replicate over time. So decolonial scholars like Franz Fanon have talked about the way that colonial hierarchies get internalized in the form of identity. And scholars who look at power through history and time look at the way that power morphs and changes these power relationships. They change, but without changing their fundamental dimensions. So they guise them. So put simply, there's concern that the hierarchical structuring of Western institutions might keep in place a hierarchical relationship that was evident in colonialism through institutional involvement and engagement with Western legal actors. I'm going to, just for time's sake, move past these slides on legal pluralism. But I'm going to encourage you to take a look at them. You're going to have access to this PowerPoint after the session today. So we can talk a little bit about intimate partner violence and early childhood trauma before applying this to mediation. So family conflict often has a mirror, you could call it, in developmental trauma that includes experiences of trauma in early life, and I used the phrase earlier, called adverse life experiences. So these are experiences that might include abuse, neglect, or other form of dysfunction, and they seem to be especially problematic as they might impact a child's brain development at an early stage of life. And what happens with these experiences, you see the phrase on the slide, internal working models, is that they create an internal representation of the external world called an internal working model, where relationships broadly are viewed through the lens of the experience of a child with their early primary relationships. So this impacts, this wide impacts that this has, among other things, an individual's attachment system, which implicates how they form relationships later in life, and it really brings about immense challenges with emotional regulation. The context of intimate partner violence, one of the contexts and one of the ways to understand it, and we'll talk about others in a moment, is through the lens of attachment relationship. And there is some overlap between attachment dysfunction and behaviors that are exhibited in intimate partner violence. Yet, as I mentioned, intimate partner violence is more than just the accumulation of attachment dysfunction. So if we were to think of it this way, if a child is separated from a caregiver, if that attachment is disrupted, they exhibit what is called protest behavior. Okay? Protest involves anger and is intended to catch the attention of the missing adult attachment and in a way rebuke them for their absence, to say, you better not do that again, before resuming the connection. If a child with disrupted parental attachment, they may also deploy what are called reestablishing strategies, which are repeated and persistent attempts to get the attention of a missing caregiver. They will continue these repeated and persistent attempts until the connection is reestablished and they are reassured. But if the connection, the presence of the caregiver is not reestablished, a child, much like will an adult, undergoes a complex and extremely painful grief and loss process. Attachment theory came about and it attempted to apply insights from the ways that children form attachments and what happens when those attachments are disrupted to adult relationships. So at the point of separation in an adult relationship, there may be both protest and reestablishing strategies that delay the realization that the relationship is ending. And thus, family separation invokes or brings about extremely painful grief and loss processes where an individual loses a primary attachment, and even if that attachment was unhealthy or dysfunctional. And this particularly impacts the person that we call the leavee or the one who did not initiate the separation. Protest strategies and reestablishing strategies are ultimately ways to avoid and delay the excruciatingly painful grief and loss processes. So there was a poor report that came out years ago that criticized the family legal system for taking issues that are really human issues of grief and loss and turning them into complex legal problems. That's to say that one of the things we need to do is encourage people that are going through grief and loss related to the ending of a family relationship to grieve, courageously grieve, and face those emotions. That is something we can do to help. Yet, intimate partner violence is more than just attachment dysfunction. So there's recently a report by Dr. Kim Stanton that criticized the BC legal system and noted that intimate partner violence is epidemic. And I'm not going to go over the statistical reality of it right now, but in Western societies, we have incredibly high rates of private intimate partner violence. I'll note that intimate partner violence is considered to be a form of gender-based violence, which means, okay, here's the light. I'll be right back. Okay. I mentioned that that would be coming. That it takes its structure from a broader ideology that we call patriarchy. And then in the minutiae of a family relationship or an intimate partnership, it attempts to create patterns of submission and domination that reflect the broader political patriarchal structure of society. So that's a structuralist view. Post-structural feminists came to the conclusion that that view was a bit limiting, that there is agency within the structures, so that even within the broader structure of agency, they found that women are always, as intimate partner violence disproportionately impacts women, finding ways to express our agency within the systems. I've noted work by Evan Stark in 2007 on coercion and control. Many of you are probably familiar with this phrase. And it's brought about an evolution of our understanding of what intimate partner violence is. It refers to what Stark calls torrents of abuse. So subtle and non-subtle continual patterns that are intended to bring about these submission, control, and domination dynamics in an intimate partnership, and then include emotional, physical, sexual, financial abuse, including stalking behaviors in isolation from family members. A lot of the resistance to use of mediation in circumstances of intimate partner violence have to do with concern about whether family mediators are equipped enough to address this dynamic. And then I've just noted that in legal systems, intimate partner violence survivors have very specific challenges. So first, they're often operating in multiple overlapping legal jurisdictions. These can include family, criminal, immigration, housing, child protection, among others, and they're often complicated and expensive legal processes. I've mentioned this earlier, that there's concern that the legal system itself and the process of mediation itself can also be misused as a tool of coercion and control. Third, they may be experiencing what are common societal biases around intimate partner violence as they engage the legal system. They might not be believed. They may not be seen as having the decision-making capacity to make their own choices around safety. They may be seen as categorically vulnerable, and that reinforces a view that they need protection from the legal system, which is true, but we'll talk about a more nuanced view of vulnerability when we get into that part. And finally, there is risk of re-victimization, which refers to a recreation of the dimensions of agency of the initial harm related to intimate partner violence in their engagement with a formal legal institution. So we want to address all of these issues in our design. When we get to trauma-informed practice, what we want to understand with this model is it's not a therapeutic model necessarily. What this is meant to do is supplement therapeutic approaches that are doing more concerted work with counselors or psychologists. And really what this is doing is bringing awareness to the reality and the normalcy of trauma experiences, trying to design legal systems and responses that avoid re-traumatization and promote feelings of safety, understand trauma symptoms so we can notice and identify it, notice a bit about the history of trauma, consider the ways that that might impact the way a person shows up in a legal system, what kind of adaptations they may need, and the relationship of trauma with other broader systems of help. And it also factors in that trauma recovery is not a linear journey, that there's a possibility of moving in and out of maladaptive coping strategies. So this is what it does. There's 6 key principles of trauma-informed practice: safety, trust, choice, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, and consideration to the context. Now, I really like these principles because I think generally when we design around these principles, they're things that all of us need when we're accessing services, and they align very closely with core emphasis in mediation practice. So let's go through each of them one by one and think for a moment about how they might be applied to the design of mediation. And at this point, I'm going to be thinking in terms of circumstances of intimate partner violence and folks who have a history of trauma, both intrapersonal and considering the history and legacy of colonialism. First, to safety, I'll note the core concerns that come from advocacy groups and some literature in intimate partner violence that suggests mediation might not adequately address the dynamics of coercion and control, and it raises concerns that mediators aren't trained enough to properly and adequately screen for violence when there is coercion and control. It notes that coercion is subtle and that there's risk that these dynamics may go unidentified in a family mediation process, and that agreements may continue to reflect unequal dynamics between participants. And of course, if we're doing mediation in circumstances of intimate partner violence, there's risk of violence in process, but even more after process when the presence of the mediator is no longer there. So we need to consider all of those things. I've noted at the top, I think that mediation, my perspective, is at its infancy stage, early stage in adaptation to intimate partner violence. In my view is that it actually needs better worked out adaptation to fit this phenomena that we call intimate partner violence that is so pervasive in society. The approach that I'm going to suggest to you today builds in equity into the design of family mediation in circumstances of violence. To the second point, I'm going to note the tense relationship between safety and agency, in that it is true we have to design mediation in ways that keep participants safe from further violence. Our processes themselves cannot risk further harm. Yet, in the same way that we critique the legal system for re-victimization, if we deny someone, a survivor of intimate partner violence, the option to participate in mediation, that might be another form of disempowerment in limiting their agency. So there is a complex tension between safety and the need to protect and the agency of the participant. And I think we need to hold those tensions together. We're going to consider a number of factors, including increased risk of harm from the point of separation, the timeline from the point of violence, and the types of violence, the frequency, the severity, the intensity, among other things. I have a slide that will look more closely at screening for violence. If there is any risk of physical safety whatsoever, mediation wouldn't be the correct process if this process would bring about any other harm. Michael Sinai is the first to really begin writing about this. And Sinai's work is more rooted in trauma and developmental trauma. And he's trying to say that we need to mediate in a window of tolerance. So if I'm thinking about trauma, there's a window where I'm not hyper aroused or where I'm not hypo aroused. And I need to be able to regulate and ideally mediate in that window. The design of mediation that might enhance safety, there's many things we can do. So we build in breaks, we build in support persons, we have complex discussion on who attends. Is it support persons? Is it lawyers? Is it family? Is it community members? What space is used? We might have separate entrance and exits. How do we open and close? The mediation becomes very important. What format? So I've noted that shuttle and virtual mediation add natural buffers and that they may be preferred in circumstances of violence. What language is used and what time in the process is it used? So I'll highlight that extensive training is needed to adequately screen and adapt mediation for safety concerns. I think that preparation is essential and key. So I've noted that we can role play different scenarios with people if we have any concern about how they'll interact in a mediation process, including the use of voice or feedback or saying things that might bring about, especially for the person responsible for the violence, anger. So I want to role play scenarios with them until I sense that they're ready. And if I could dream of a mediation system, this is what I would dream. I would assign, when preferred, in-cultural mentors that are alongside people as they go through this process and help them to regulate and provide them some feedback on how they need to just show up in the process. There's benefits. Agreements can also include safety practices. I can task people before they come in to undertake certain tasks like counseling, therapy, group attendance, timeline, education. And in a trauma-informed practice, I can arrange a cue with an individual who's been affected by violence that they're going to cue me that they need to end the process, and then I can end it at that point. And that I always want to end processes at around mid-intensity. I'm going to skip the slide on screening for violence, particularly because this requires extensive training. So just the first point there today, but you can view this later for some preliminary points. Trustworthiness in family mediation is one of my favorite things to discuss. It roots us in the anthropological origins of conflict resolution, which was always a community-based practice. Over time, it's become very professionalized, but early conflict was always done by insiders in communities. and it involves the formation of authentic relationships. So I like the quote on the right-hand side from Irene Bruna that says, breakthrough only happens when mediators relate to parties more personally and engage with what lies beyond the manifested behavior. So we can have all the tools. Some of the conflict resolution will just have to do with how you personally relate with someone. And there's a number of considerations there. I'll just highlight the amount of time it takes to form authentic relationships, importance of consistent, familiar, predictable mediation, transparent expectations and expectation setting, comfortable space, and a mediator who is not distracted, who is listening and is present. Choice in family mediation, Michael Sinai again notes that individuals should be viewed as experts in their own lives. And considerations to choice roots us in the key values of self-determination and agency. Just noting again that agency loss is a key figure of intimate partner violence. So if I want to create lived experience justice through the process of mediation, I want to build a lot of opportunity in for agency. Bush and Miller, who wrote on transformative mediation, note that agency is a core component of human identity. So when I am conducting mediation, I want to think of it as a co-designed process. And co-design suggests that I'm equalizing my own power relationship with participants who are involved in the process. I've noted equity in design. So if I'm mediating in circumstances of intimate partner violence, I may prioritize intentionally and transparently some of the design choices of the person that is more affected by the violence. There's a number of choices that can be built into a mediation process. And I've noted the tool that I often instruct in called waiving power, where a mediator takes more or less control of a process pending responsible participation. And responsible participation has to do with responsible with the vulnerability of the other person, responsible regulation. Collaboration and mutuality comes with a fundamental shift and the shift in the literature comes from, sorry for the technical academic jargon, but from a positivist or a legal positivist worldview to a post-positivist worldview. Although these are legal jargon kind of words, they're of essential importance. A legal positivist worldview envisions a mediator or a legal practitioner as standing way back. They're objective, they're impartial, they don't have any biases. They're in a hierarchical relationship with the person that they're serving. So there's a clear power dynamic between them, and they're not seen to impact the conflict system. A post-positivist viewpoint takes for granted, of course, just by my very presence, even if I hold myself way back, I'm going to impact this conflict system. And it builds in a relational worldview where that's much more mutual and intentionally attempts to equalize relationships in the mediation exchange. So it comes along with a movement from impersonal, detached service to something that's far more relational, from neutral, impartial facilitators to what I call nuanced impartiality, which I'm going to review with you in a moment, from exclusively hierarchical relating to mutual problem solving, negotiation, from non-mutual relating to relating in a professional context that has elements of mutuality, and from exclusively professional client relating models to I'm going to hold some of the things I need from professionalism, but I'm also seeing myself as somewhat of a community member. And what this means practically, and this is something that comes very interestingly out of the intimate partner violence literature, is that some mutual sharing can be helpful as long as there's a reflexive recentering of the narrative of the person that you're working with or that has been affected by the violence. The way that intimate partner violence scholars talk about this is that it has to do with your own level of healing. So if I'm working with an individual and I'm finding myself getting really angry at points of their story or really down, or I'm sharing my own experience and I'm crying, And that means that I'm projecting some of my own unhealed parts onto the person that I'm working with. So I'm going to take a step back. Instead, I want to be more of a landscape that I can listen and be with the whole complexity of their experience. I can share a little bit of my own. I have some experience with that, but then I reflexively recenter their experience. Empowerment in family mediation is a lot to do with how we understand capability. When someone has a lived experience of something like intimate partner violence, um, we see that as part of their capability. They have some essential knowledge to offer to us, but they also have skills and expertise that they've gained through the course of their life that can be considered capability. If there's a capability that I'm noticing and seeing that's missing, I'm wondering if that capability can be developed. So that could be things like emotional regulation skills or legal capabilities or conflict resolution capabilities. And so I want to see if through things like coaching, training, role play, education, counseling, therapy, choices, that I can actually increase the capability of someone vis-a-vis their own conflict. Ultimately, I don't want to create dependencies on me as a facilitator, and I want to view them as the experts in their own conflict. And I'm going to continue onward here just for time's sake. Context in family mediation, again, is an understanding that mediation doesn't sort of sit apart from all the broader structuring forces, including patriarchy. It is conditioned by those broader ideologies. Um, Feminists talk about applying an intersectional lens to our understanding of safety, which means that we have to design our safety practices in consideration of broader social categories that include the way race, gender, sex, religion, status, and ability might shape someone's intimate partner violence experience. And they try to press us beyond just being free from violence to seeing that safety involves also meeting human needs. And they might also include in that a focus or an emphasis on developing mastery, social connectedness, stability in life, and meaningful access to resources all around safety. Here, to consider, if I was to consider the broader structural context of mediation, here's where I'll talk about what I call nuanced impartiality. I've been critical of impartiality in that there's sort of an inevitability of bias that we can never truly overcome. And there's sort of, so I'm always, as a mediator, working with my own bias as it is. And in family conflict, and when there's conflict related to intimate partner violence, I don't think it's helpful for mediators to adopt an exclusively impartial stance, much in the way that formal law does. So I think that we need to think about impartiality as it might relate to equity to form something that would be more like a nuanced impartiality, where I wouldn't be impartial on issues of Indigenous justice, identity, gender, intimate partner violence, where I might remain a neutral, impartial practitioner on legal issues related to those, the family law issue that they need to discuss, but not on issues of communication and behavior. So that's what I have in mind there. I'll note in this final slide here that I see also a possibility for what is called restorative mediation, which draws principles from restorative justice through individually preparing parties to participate, the person that is responsible for the violence to take ownership and bear the cost of repairing the harm, and the person who's affected by the intimate partner violence to be able to share the impacts of the harm and their needs. This rests on a high responsibility taking measure, so that has to be there by the person responsible for the violence. The community may be able to be involved in assisting with accountability, and a restorative mediation may include both legal concepts and discussions that look at the harm and repairing the harm. It would include long preparation periods, aspects of education, particularly for the person responsible for the violence, storytelling, which is viewed as a justice activity, um, just with a note that forgiveness and restoration could occur, although they cannot be pressured and are not a condition of activity. There may be cultural symbols and ceremonies, and it could include both practical legal outcomes and also restorative actions and agreements. So I feel like there I'm going to stop now. I've been a bit of a fire hose of information, and I went a little bit faster than I'd like to today. I'm going to pass it over to Michelle, who's going to facilitate some question and answer. And we've got about 10 minutes or so, so I'll give it to Michelle.
Oh, well, thank you, Erin. That was amazing. I feel like we really could have done double the time
Double the time. I'm sorry about
easily.
that.
So, maybe we'll have to have you back. But yeah, thank you so much for all of that amazing insight. I mean, I feel my mind like just sort of turning, particularly as we were wrapping up. I was, when you were talking about the impartiality, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, because I often act as a role as an advocate, legal counsel, sometimes as a mediator where I'm formally mediating. But and even more and more is sort of informal dispute resolution where you're maybe working with other people or working, as a service provider, you're providing assistance to both sides and trying to navigate how to make the system work and what our own feelings might do within
Uh,
that. So I found that all really insightful. I think we know we don't have a ton of time for questions, but I imagine there are some questions or comments. So I'm just going to open it up. And I don't know, Santana, if there's any, I don't see any in the chat, but I'm not sure if I'm seeing everything, but are there? Santana? Okay, so we'll get to the chat in a bit. Is there anyone who has any thoughts, questions, comments for Erin?
Yeah, Michelle, there's no questions in the chat, so if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute and ask them.
Great. We'll also be posting this whole presentation. It'll be up on the Law Society of Nunavut website. So anyone who wants to look more at the presentation or pass this on, it will be available there. I see one question. Elise?
Hi, Michelle. Nice to see you. I was just, it's just sort of maybe a bit of a comment, but I do find it interesting, like in some ways that since the mid 90s, the provincial government has been implementing various policies and I worked as a policy analyst in the mid 90s, dating myself, on violence against women. And we did a whole dog and pony show across the whole province. So in some ways, when I was listening to Aaron, I was thinking, oh no, things haven't changed at all. But then his insights with the layer of trauma on it has really brought it deeper and I think more um meaningful in a sense that you can really work with clients with kind of the tips and insights he was providing. So on the other hand, I'm really encouraged and so I just wanted to give that feedback like, yay, this is those I love a training where you have takeaways and clearly there are, takeaways here that I can bring to my mediation. I've got a pre-mediation in half an hour and I'll have this, like you were saying, all these thoughts percolating in our minds. I don't think I would go as far as to take on the restorative mediation piece, although it sounds fascinating. So maybe that is the question, Aaron. Does that need like a specific, I mean, it's so great, but I'm a family lawyer and can I and mediator. Can I bring that to my practice? I don't know.
Yeah. I'll touch on restorative mediation. Then I saw nuance and partiality from Grace. It is my most sort of controversial idea in a way. Um, so I think that with restorative training, and I think my view is that the different contexts that restorative justice is now beginning to be used in particular around gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and sexual violence, it seems to me that there is space for restorative mediation. That in circumstances of intimate partner violence that has both a legal aspect and if this high bar of responsibility taking is there, could be a very effective process. I see it used in other spaces with high data for effectiveness. It's supported empirically, and I think it can be done very safely over long time trajectories that include lots of preparation. So we're not doing any guesswork about how people are going to show up by the time they get there. So my only comment then is we need sort of more training in that. Um, I'm going to go to Grace's comment on elaborating on nuanced impartiality. So my biggest issue, I think, so if I go back to Dr. Kim Stanton, who wrote the report, one of Stanton's comments, this is on gender violence and sexual-based violence, so we basically stagnated. Maybe this goes to Elisa's comment, as it relates to how we deal with these issues in the legal system. And part of this in law is out of a commitment to impartiality. And this means that law can't consider the broader social context of violence, which is primarily perpetrated by men towards women. There's a real gender dynamic to that, although with the caveat that it's important that we consider and treat every experience as original and unique. So among other factors, we need to consider, we need to not be so committed to impartiality that we can't consider the broader social institutional structuring practice of intimate partner violence if we want to break this stagnation. So what I mean by nuanced impartiality is that, and if I put it in the most simplest terms possible, I talk when Kelly and Douglas and I do presentations together, I often talk about this, that sometimes I'm going to be very impartial, especially as it relates to legal issues. But if I'm seeing things that are unequal, if there's issues of race, of gender, of sexuality that emerge in the mediation, if I'm seeing a drastic power imbalance, if I'm seeing different communication strategies and there's one person more responsible than the other, I'm not going to be impartial to those things because it's not helpful to people. What especially individuals who are responsible for violence most need is not an impartial facilitator. They need a relative who can nudge them. And so sometimes I have to provide a nudge in a way that does not impact their equal access to a legal fairness in a process. But that might not be communication fairness. So I'm gonna nudge, and I'm gonna be impartial, to put it that way. This idea still needs some working out, and it is one of my is bigger, more controversial ones. But thank you, Grace, for asking that question. Was there anything else, Michelle? And I've gone dark here again.
There are a couple other questions or comments, but they're around the same vein around around the IPV, family violence and the nuanced impartiality. And then there was just a comment, thank you for the presentation. Here in Brazil, we're working toward improving mediation and conciliation. And so that will be helpful. Number of comments about how excellent your presentation is.
Thank you.
And I guess I just want to comment that in Nunavut, I think there's, some other complicated particular challenges with respect to sometimes there's just such a limited range of options for resolution, right? Like there's limited resources, there's limited legal services. We have the community justice with the CJAWs, community justice outreach workers who are responsible for helping people get emergency protection orders. And, how And I think this has been really helpful to, give some ideas around how do we, as practitioners where you're working in this kind of challenging environment with limited resources, bring some of these ideas forward to ensure that people are getting as much help as they can. I think it's been very helpful.
Oh, wonderful.
So there's a few other comments, but thank you. I don't see any other blazing questions, but is there any last minute questions for anyone? Someone just said, coming from Nunavut, it is quite challenging looking for proper help here in Nunavut. So kind of going to the comment that I had just said. And yeah, I think that is it. So thank you, Erin, so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And like I said, we might have you come back to do a backup session because I feel like my mind is going to explode and there's so much more that I would love to hear more about. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And like I said, everyone, the full presentation will be up online as well as the PowerPoint. So yes, you can look for it there. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much, Erin.